Hello and welcome to the fourth in this series of lectures based upon the history of Christendom, which is the fruits of my research of my writing of a book, which we published at some stage in the future. Just to remind us of our modus operandi as regards this series as a whole, the previous lectures so far, is that we are looking in each century at the good, the bad, and the beautiful. So we're looking at those things in each century that exemplify, shall we say, the city of God, Augustine's city of God in history. We're also looking at those aspects of history that exemplify the city of man, so should we say the secular or the sinful, and certainly the anti-Christian or the decadent. And we're also looking in every century at the beautiful. So in every century there have been manifestations of human creativity that has shone forth the presence of the divine in each century. So one thing, because we have the good and the bad in each century, that there's no golden age in an absolute sense of the word. I sometimes say the only golden rule is there is no golden age. But if there was a period in history that has a claim from the perspective of Christendom for being in the golden age, it would surely be the High Middle Ages. And so we're going to look at this. Certainly there was a Jesuit historian who we'll be quoting later, who wrote a book about the 13th century, which he called the best of centuries, the greatest of centuries. And there's certainly an argument for that. But I'm tempted nonetheless, even in a talk on the 11th to the 13th centuries, to title it the best and worst of times. So to pluck some lines from the opening sentence of Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So beginning in the 11th century, I want to, Diane Moxar in her book 10 Dates Every Catholic Should Know picks out 1000 AD, in other words the beginning of the 11th century, as one of those 10 dates that every Catholic should know. She calls it the gateway to the Church's most glorious age. And this is the quote: "That millennial year may be taken as the gateway to a glorious period in history. The 3 centuries that followed it included the rise of the papacy to the highest point of its power and prestige, the development of the European nations, the greatest burst of cultural and constitutional creativity in Western history, more saints than one can keep track of, and more material prosperity." So certainly the best of times, shall we say here. And it was, the 11th century certainly was a golden age of the papacy. So again, we have good and bad centuries as regard the popes, but the 11th century was certainly good. The string of very good popes, Gregory VI, Leo IX, Gregory VII. So these were reforming popes that began to tackle the decadence in the church, insisting that priests should be faithful to their vows of celibacy, and to reject and discipline the corrupt practice of simony, the selling of spiritual services for financial gain. Even the Roman emperor himself, Henry IV, was excommunicated for his obstinacy in corruption. Quote, "Since the day when the church placed me on its apostolic throne," wrote Pope Gregory shortly before his death in 1085, "my whole desire and the end of all my striving has been that the Holy Church should recover her honour and remain free and chaste and Catholic." And as for Gregory's contemporary, Paul of Bernried, he wrote the following in his Life of Gregory VII, published in 1128. "He endured perfidy and temptation, perils, insults, captivity and exile for the love of God. By the grace of that same God, and by the aid of the apostles, kings, tyrants, dukes, princes, all the jailers of human souls, all the ravenous wolves, all the ministers of Antichrist were vanquished by this invincible athlete." You've got to admire strident prose of that ilk from almost a contemporary of the Pope. It was also a time of what the church would now call subsidiarity, in the sense that the Holy Roman Empire seemed willing to allow nation states to have an element of autonomy. So it was the rise of nations as distinct from empire. This was the period, the rise of Hungary, Russia, Norway, Iceland. According to Christopher Dawson, the rise of independent nations was a consequence of the Emperor Otto III's decentralization of power to local areas, a policy which would now be called subsidiarist or localist in principle. And this is the quote from Christopher Dawson from The Religion and the Rise of Western Culture. The radical transformation of policy which altered the whole history of Central and Eastern Europe was primarily due to the passing of the leadership in the conversion of the new peoples from the empire to the rulers of those peoples themselves. It was rendered possible by Otto III's wider conception of the empire as a society of Christian peoples, which made him welcome the formation of new Christian kingdoms and the creation of new churches in direct dependence on Rome rather than on the German hierarchy. End of the quote. Otto II, in league with Pope Sylvester II, created the new Christian kingdom and hierarchy of Hungary in 1000 AD. The new nation's first king, St. Stephen, received the Holy Crown, the sacred symbol of Hungarian royalty, establishing an apostolic kingdom that, in the words of Christopher Dawson, quote, was to be the eastern bulwark of Christendom. The conversion of Hungary, even more than that of Poland, opened the way to Christian culture in Eastern Europe, since the Middle Danube has always been the chief gateway between East and West. End quote. So as I've said, as well as Hungary as this new emergent Christian nation helping to evangelize eastwards, Russia at this time with St. Vladimir was experiencing a golden age. Norway, relatively recently converted, with great saints such as St. Olaf, and even far away hinterlands of Europe, in fact about as far from the Rome within Europe as you can imagine, Iceland. The Norse conversion was happening at around this time. In England we had a king, Canute, who's often given a bad rap, and I want to say something about him. I'm actually just going to quote this passage from my own manuscript. The 11th century also saw a Scandinavian, King Canute, on the throne of England. Reigning from 1016 until 1035, he is best known to posterity for the legendary account of his ordering the tide to obey him. Although this is often cited as evidence of the foolishness of egocentric rulers who tried to stop the tide, the true source of the account, which dates from the 12th century, demonstrates Canute's piety and humility, not his folly and pride. According to the 12th century account by Henry of Huntingdon, Canute ordered his throne to be placed on the beach, and then, sitting on it, he ordered the incoming tide to stop. When the tide lapped against his feet, in defiance of the royal command, he used the incident to teach a priceless lesson to flattering courtiers. Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, he declaimed. For there is none worthy of the name, but he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws. End quote. He then hung his crown on a crucifix, and according to the account, never wore it again, to the honour of God, the Almighty King. End quote. The episode shows King Canute to be a kindred spirit to the chastened and converted King Lear, who refers to flattering courtiers as gilded butterflies and poor rogues who talk of court news. Such men are not to be trusted, either in history or on the stage. Although most historians question the veracity of this anecdotal episode, seeing it as apocryphal, the fact that the source for the story dates from only a century after Canute's own time suggests that Canute was known for his wisdom and Christian piety, irrespective of the factual veracity of Henry of Huntingdon's account. Later in that same century, the 11th century, we had a saint on the throne of England, St. Edward the Confessor. bringing down the curtain, if you like, on Anglo-Saxon England, which basically lasted from the leaving of the Romans in the mid-5th century until the Norman conquest in 1066, of which more in a moment. This saintly king was on the throne in 1061 when there was the Marian apparition of Our Lady of Walsingham, where the Blessed Virgin appears to a noble woman in the county of Norfolk in England, and Walsingham quickly becomes, throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the whole of this period that we're speaking this evening, and the centuries following, the major Marian shrine in Christendom, with people travelling from all over Christendom to Walsingham in homage of the Blessed Virgin. But 5 years after that apparition, it's as if Anglo-Saxon England goes out like a supernova. It's at its brightest as it dies. We have the Norman conquest of 1066. And I want to give an anecdote about that, which I find amusing and entertaining and enlightening. Two of my favourite writers are J.R.R. Tolkien and Hilaire Belloc, and the two were loggerheads over whether 1066 was a good or bad thing. There was an account that Belloc was giving a talk in Oxford. Tolkien, of course, was a professor of philology at Oxford University, and he attended the talk. Sitting right behind him is the famous Jesuit Father Martin Darcy, who observed what unfolded. So Belloc is basically giving this talk where the Norman conquest was the best thing that could have happened to England, because it brought England into the fullness of communion with the continental church. For Belloc, of course, the centre of Christendom was always France. And as Belloc is giving this account of how 1066 united English church with the continental church, Father Darcy observed Hilaire Belloc Tolkien squirming in his chair and muttering under his breath about, obviously, he's disagreeing with it. And Father Darcy whispered in his ear, "Why don't you ask a question?" And Tolkien looked at him in horror, saying, "You don't ask Hilaire Belloc a question unless you've done all your research first." But the key is that I'm certainly make no bones about being on Tolkien's side in this dispute, even though I'm a great admirer of both men. Anybody who studied Anglo-Saxon England will know it was a golden age of Catholicism. It was awash with saints, numerous saints, and great works of literature such as Beowulf, The Dream of the Rood, Caedmon's Hymn to Creation, The Wanderer, etc. And then, of course, was graced, no less, by an apparition of the Blessed Virgin while there was a saint on the throne. That's how Anglo-Saxon England was when the Normans invaded, and certainly after that, the Normans continued to build churches. There was a continuum. It's not as if there was either or, but England did not need the Norman conquest to make it more Catholic. Okay, so that's for the most part the good things about the 11th century. We'll now move on to the bad. And certainly there was a time of corrupt bishops. So Pope Gregory VII, this good Holy Pope, lamented the widespread corruption both inside and outside the church. And this actually is a quote from Harry Crocker's Triumph, the Power and the Glory of the Catholic Church. "The Eastern Church has fallen away from the faith and is now assailed," this is a quote by Pope Gregory VII though, "The Eastern Church has fallen away from the faith and is now assailed on every side by infidels. Wherever I turn my eyes, to the west, to the north or to the south, I find everywhere bishops who have obtained their office in an irregular way, whose lives and conversation are strangely at variance with their sacred calling, who go through their duties not for the love of Christ, but for motives of worldly gain. There are no longer princes who set God's honour before their own selfish ends, or who allow justice to stand in the way of their ambition." So here we see, should we say, the bad side of the 11th century. 1054, 11th century, was the great schism between East and West, where Eastern Christendom was separated, divorced from Western Christendom, one of the momentously bad moments in history. And of course, you had the rise of Islam, the holy sites being overrun by the power of Islam, and the First Crusade being called in 1095 to try to liberate the holy sites. So even Diana Moxar, the gateway 1000 to Christendom, lots of bad things happening. As regards the beautiful, irrespective of what we think of 1066, the Bayeux tapestry is one of the great works of art, one of the great masterpieces of Western civilization. The long tapestry which gives the history of the Norman conquest. There's also a Norse saga, King Harold's saga, which also gives an account of that conquest. The Vladimir Madonna, one of the greatest icons, was created at this time in Kiev, which was the heart of Russian Christianity. Saint Sophia, the cathedral, was also built in Kiev at this time, and it was also the rise of Romanesque architecture. So in these manifest ways, we see how the beautiful praises God. Now we're going to move into the 12th century. Well, the first obvious good, the rise of the universities. So the earliest university was in Bologna, and actually dates back to the end of the 11th century, but was not formally established until 1158. Paris, the University of Paris, was established by 1150, and Oxford by 1167. So this rise of the universities under the patronage of the church. It's also the time when, via Arab scholars, that the Western philosophy discovered and enthused over the ideas of Aristotle, and this was the rise of scholasticism. And St. Anselm of Canterbury was perhaps the pioneer of this new scholasticism in philosophy, where the ideas of Aristotle are being added to those of Plato as the foundations of Christian philosophy. There's also a new religious order at this time, the Cistercians. And to give an indication of how much the Cistercian order rose during this century, just statistics will do the job for us. In 1122, there were only 19 Cistercian abbeys, priories in existence. By 1199, by the end of the century, there were 530. So from 19 to 530, that's the rise of the Cistercians during the 12th century. And then we have the Crusades. And I must admit that sometimes it's not necessarily very easy to know where to categorize something in terms of good and bad, and the Crusades certainly straddle both. I actually decided to put them in the 12th century discussion under the bad, and I'm going to, before I get shot down in flames, going to read what I got from what I've written in my manuscript to justify. It's obviously a mixed blessing. I'm not completely condemning the Crusades, or certainly not just war theory. Where does one place the Crusades in the history of Christendom? Should they be ranked amongst that which is good, as a manifestation of a just war against hostile infidels intent on destroying Christendom? That was certainly the view of the church at the time. Even great saints, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, preached that the Crusades were a good and holy endeavour. The church's position, and that of St. Bernard, was that the Crusades were a just war in accordance with St. Augustine's teaching on the subject. The liberation of the Holy Land from Muslim control was justified. The defence of Christendom from the military threat of Islam was justified. The protection of pilgrims en route to the holy shrines was justified, as was the protection of the holy shrines themselves. Yet even ardent defenders of the Church, such as the Catholic historian Alan Schreck, are forced to question whether the theoretical justice of a cause should be allowed to diminish the wickedness done in its name. Quote, "In theory, the Crusades might have been justified," he writes, "but due to man's fallen nature, the results of these wars were often tragic," end quote. Although the First Crusade had been a military success, Schreck reminds us that the expulsion of the Greek patriarch from Antioch had deepened the division between the Eastern and Western Church. He also condemns, as all Christians must, the indiscriminate killing of hundreds of innocent people by the Crusaders after they had captured Jerusalem. The Second Crusade in 1146 was a military failure, and the Third Crusade in 1189 could only claim partial success in terms of the signing of a treaty guaranteeing the safety of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. As for the Crusades of the following century, they were increasingly conducted for the very prideful and mercenary motives which Pope Urban II had specifically forbidden in his preaching of the First Crusade. Another Catholic historian, Christopher Dawson, puts a braver face on things, at least with respect to the success of the First Crusade. Quote, "In any age it would have been an achievement of the first magnitude to march an army overland from France through Asia Minor to Antioch and Jerusalem to defeat the Turkish and Egyptian forces and to establish a chain of Christian states along the Syrian coast and inland as far as Edessa and the Euphrates. It marks a turning point in the history of the West, ending the long centuries of weakness and isolation and cultural inferiority and bringing the new peoples of Western Christendom back to the old centres of Eastern Mediterranean culture." End quote. Dawson continues by affirming that the success of the First Crusade, quote, "was rendered possible by the overmastering unifying power of religious passion." End quote. As for the Crusades taken as a whole, Dawson's final verdict appears to be in their favour. Quote, "So long as the Crusades continued, the unity of Christendom found expression in a dynamic, militant activity which satisfied the aggressive instincts of Western man, while at the same time sublimating them in terms of religious idealism." End quote. Begging to differ, at least a little, dare we ask why the satisfaction of the, quote, "aggressive instincts of Western man," end quote, is worth celebrating, irrespective of they are being sublimated by religious idealism. In the final analysis, however, Dawson appears to agree with Alan Schreck in his confession of an element of ambivalence. Quote, "The Crusades expressed all that was highest and lowest in medieval society, the aggressive acquisitiveness of a Bohemond or a Charles of Anjou, and the heroic self-abnegation of a Godfrey of Bouillon and a St. Louis." Thus, for a bit of controversy on the Crusades. You can't beat controversy. Everybody needs some controversy. Another thing which is both bad and good, actually, in the same century, 1170, was the episode surrounding St. Thomas Becket and his martyrdom, his murder, apparently on the orders of King Henry II. Hilaire Belloc was in no doubt of the historical importance of St. Thomas's martyrdom, which was the consequence of what he called the saint's heroic resistance. The principle for which St. Thomas suffered martyrdom was as clear as it was noble. Quote, "That the Church of God is a visible, single, universal society with powers superior to those of this world, and therefore of right autonomous. That principle is the negation of the opposite, the principle that the divine and permanent is subject to the human and passing power. St. Thomas died for the doctrine, the truth, that the link with eternal things must never be broken under the pressure of ephemeral desires, that the control of eternal things cannot, in morals, be subjected to the ephemeral arrangements of men." End quote. Having stated the principle for which St. Thomas of Canterbury laid down his life, Belloc proceeds to an appraisal of the historical significance and importance of the saint's heroic resistance, which struck a blow for religious liberty against the encroachments of secular tyranny, the impact of which would reverberate down the centuries. Again, this is quoting Belloc. "Those few moments of tragedy in the north transept of Canterbury had done what so many years of effort had so far failed to do. The whole movement against the autonomy of the Church was stopped dead. The tide ran rapidly backward. Within an hour, St. Thomas was a martyr. Within a month, the champion not only of religion but of the common people, who obscurely but firmly knew that the independence of the church was their safeguard. A tale of miracles began, and within a year the name of St. Thomas of Canterbury was standing permanently above and throughout Christendom. Everywhere there were chapels and churches raised to his name, and then came the great uninterrupted pilgrimages to his shrine year after year until it rivaled St. James of Compostela, becoming the second great centre in the West, loaded with gems and gold and endowment. So on that positive note, we'll end the discussion of the bad, which is also good, so to speak, in its consequences. And we're going to end with the beautiful, and it was certainly a time of the thriving of architecture in general, Christian architecture, the Romanesque, not quite the Gothic, that's the next century, the troubadours, and they were a mixed blessing. Dante, for instance, places one of the famous troubadours in hell, another in purgatory, and I think one also in paradise, which basically sums them up. It's wandering minstrels, but they were also in some sense romantics, long before the Romanticism came along, and songs of courtly love, which were often merely stylized desire for adultery. But simultaneous with the troubadours, you had the chansons de geste, most famous of which from this time was the Song of Roland, with the heroism of the Christians against the infidel. And perhaps the giantess of this century as regards the beautiful was Hildegard of Bingen, who was named the Doctor of the Church in 2012. Apart from obviously her theology, we also have great compositions in music that she wrote. And this brings us on to the third and final of the 3 centuries we're going to be discussing in this lecture, the 13th century. And again, this is often the one that is seen as the greatest of all centuries in the history of Christendom. And we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the beautiful. According to church historian Alan Schreck, the 13th century was, quote, the greatest century of spiritual, cultural, and intellectual advancement in the history of Western civilization. The 13th century was the flower of the Middle Ages and the height of Christendom. In almost every area of life, we see the influence of the church and the advancement of culture and learning. Certainly there were dark moments, such as the Crusades and the Inquisition launched against heresies, but the light of the achievements of this century far outshines the darkness and illumines the Catholic Church even today. One event at the beginning of the century, near the beginning, 1215, was the signing of the Magna Carta. And what is not known is that was mostly done at the behest of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who probably wrote at least the first draft of it. And it is his influence that brought it about. And this is also interesting because a part of course as the Magna Carta forming the foundation of English law, it was also very influential upon the American Republic, the United States. So Magna Carta here as essentially a Catholic Catholic document expressive of Catholic social doctrine, has played a crucial part in the development not only of England but of the United States. The 13th century, of course, was the 2 great new mendicant orders, the St. Francis, the Franciscans, St. Dominic, the Dominicans. And as regards the Dominicans, it's also the rise of certainly the golden age of scholasticism, first of all with Albert the Great, and then with his great disciple, Thomas Aquinas. And to this day, Aquinas, quite rightly, is known as the angelic doctor. He is the preeminent theologian and philosopher of the Catholic Church. So there's no denying at all, in that case, the 13th century is a golden age as regards fides et ratio, faith and reason. Other great saints of the 13th century, St. Anthony of Padua, one of the great disciples of St. Francis, of course, St. Elizabeth of Hungary, St. Clare of Assisi, St. Louis IX, and St. Celestine V, who very, very holy man, hence being canonized, but actually resigned from the papacy and it's generally believed that Celestine V is the Pope whom Dante, in his questionable wisdom on this occasion, placed in hell for his great refusal, another refusal to serve as the papacy. So this is also the century, however, in which, if we're now moving on to say the dark underbelly of the century, having obviously confessed triumphantly and triumphantistically the glories of the 13th century, the dark underbelly is the floundering of the Crusades, which we might almost see as the self-defeat of the Crusades. But at the same time, the great victory in the West, on the Western Front, if you like, with the cleansing of the Iberian Peninsula of the Muslim presence. So victory on the Western Front, even as there was defeat, if you like, on the Eastern Front. We have the Inquisition, and certainly a talk on the history of Christendom. Everybody expects the Spanish Inquisition, so we will have it. We'll conclude our survey of the dark underbelly of the greatest century with a brief consideration of the role of the Inquisition. It is the Church's responsibility to refute error and to counter its harmful effects. This is best done, however, through the use of reason employed with charity. The great philosophical and theological weapons provided by the great scholastics of the 13th century, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, provide all that is necessary for the refutation of error, together with sanctity and the edifying power of beauty. The use of barbaric methods of persuasion, such as torture, should always be anathema. Christ did not crucify his enemies, he was crucified by them. He took up his own cross and called upon his followers to take up theirs. He never called on them to nail sinners to the cross. And now for the beautiful in this discussion of the greatest of centuries. It was, of course, the rise of Gothic architecture and those magnificent edifices which still tower over the landscape of Christendom, still serving as a call to prayer, if you like, edifying the mind and soul, raising the mind and soul to God just by seeing them and being in them. And I love Chesterton wrote a wonderful essay on the Gothic architecture called The Architect of Spears. And he says in this, the truth about Gothic is, first, that it is alive, and second, that it is on the march. It is the church militant. It is the only fighting architecture. All its spires are spears at rest, and all its stones are stones asleep in a catapult. It's also the beginning of the rise of Florentine art, so the early flourishing of what would become the Renaissance in Florence. We mustn't forget two great saints who are also two great poets. St. Francis of Assisi, his canticle Brother Sun, even in translation, retains its magnificence and beauty. And last but certainly not least, Thomas Aquinas. Now I said we've lauded St. Thomas Aquinas as the angelic doctor, as the greatest of Christian philosophers and theologians. He's also certainly one of the greatest Christian poets, and certainly the sequence he wrote for Corpus Christi remains some of the most beautiful music in the church's liturgical year. We think perhaps of Tantamergo and O Salutaris Hostia and others. So I'm going to conclude by asking the question, was the 13th century the greatest of the century, or was it the best and worst of times, or perhaps both? And I'm going to finish with the words of a Jesuit historian. We began our look at this century with the claim by historian Alan Schreck that it was the greatest century in the history of Western civilization. We will end with another historian who agrees with him. James J. Walsh wrote a book entitled The 13th Greatest of Centuries. in which he justifies the enormity of the claim with the enormity of the achievement, which makes the claim justifiable. Quote, "Is it any wonder that we should call the generations that gave us the cathedrals, the universities, the great technical schools that were organised by the trades guilds, and of art carried to such heights that artistic principles were revealed for all time, and finally the great men and women of this century, for more than any other it glories in names that were born not to die? Is it at all surprising that we should claim for the period which, in addition to all this, saw the foundation of modern law and liberty, the right to be hailed the greatest of human history?" Thank you very much.